Okay, welcome back to Shooting It Straight to Revolver Shite Chapter 1. I've been spending some time on my range back there with my new Taurus Model 66. I finally got the sights somewhat dialed in. I put a few hundred rounds through it now, and the action is smoothing out. So it's very comfortable to shoot, and I have encountered zero problems thus far. Now with that, why don't we quickly talk revolver stuff for a bit and see if we can recognize some potential issues that you might want to check for. Now this video is centered specifically on modern or late 20th century revolvers using modern commercial ammo. So it's not for your 1851 Colt Navy black powder revolver. Okay, there's a bit of a difference between the two, so keep that in mind. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to this topic, so I'm going to split this discussion into two parts, or chapters, if you will, and chapter 2 will follow later. Now, right off the bat, let me put out a disclaimer here, as I frequently do. Number one, look, I'm certainly not a revolver expert. I don't claim to be. A matter of fact, until just recently, I haven't had a revolver in about 18 years now. And some things and procedures have probably changed somewhat since then. And so I may not be up to date with it all just yet. So, perhaps some of you will be able to help me in that regard and keep me up to date on some things that I may get wrong here. Number two, in this video, I will be referencing mainly Smith & Wesson revolvers, since I have more experience and training with those. As far as correct nomenclature goes, not every gun manufacturer uses the same terms or names to describe certain components. Here's a couple of examples. Most call it a cylinder release or a cylinder latch. Smith & Wesson calls it a thumb piece. So when I say thumb piece, that's what I'm referring to. Some call it an extractor rod. Other companies refer to it as an ejector rod. To me, they're the same thing. There's no difference. The component that actually rotates the cylinder via the ratchets back here is called, and you can see that right here. Well, maybe not right here. I'll try to get that. You can see it right there, that arm that makes contact with the ratchets and rotates that cylinder. Colt and Ruger refer to that piece as a pawl, P-A-W-L, while Smith & Wesson refers to it as a hand. You've got the cylinder stop down here versus the cylinder bolt. Just different names, same thing. Now, does any of that stuff really matter? No. So, let's not get caught up in such trivial linguistics. Now, similarly, certain tolerances and the specific operating details of certain components may differ from model to model or manufacturer to manufacturer. So different revolvers may have some components that perform the same basic job as other revolvers do, but they just do it in a slightly different way. But it's basically all the same thing. Now, we can learn a little about our revolvers as we go through some revolver checkpoints here to ensure that everything is in proper working order. Because the old popular claim that, and I'm going to air quote here, revolvers don't jam, well, that's not true. They have, and they still do jam, or can. and for a number of reasons. So to try and lessen the chances of it happening, we conduct periodic function checks, just as we should be doing with all firearms anyway, right? So why don't we get started with this thing called endshake. Now, endshake is the end-to-end or front-to-center movement of the cylinder while the cylinder is closed. A small amount of endshake or cylinder play like this is acceptable and it's normal. I'm not very concerned with endshake, but I hear that excessive endshake may result in increased endshake over time, which could increase cylinder battering or something like that. Most revolvers that I've had and that I have seen in law enforcement has had some amount of endshake. All right, but I've never seen any damage come from it, nor have I ever seen I've never seen it get to the level of rendering the gun dangerous or inoperable. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't possible. I'm just saying that I have never seen it. Now, if you want to determine how much endshake you may have, you'll need a set of feeler gauges, such as those in the picture. Now, I don't have any. So I'll just use this piece of paper to mimic one. Press and hold the cylinder forward, okay, all the way forward, and measure the gap between the cylinder face and the forcing cone. Stick it in between there. Now this is going to be right at 3/1000ths of an inch right here. Now remember, we had the cylinder pushed forward when we measured that. Now we're going to take that feeler gauge and we're going to measure the gap again, but we're going to do it this time with the cylinder pushed and held to the rearmost position, back as far as we can pull it, and we're going to measure it again. All right, if I can see what I'm doing. All right, yeah, and measure it that way. Okay, now take those two measurements. The difference between the two measurements, if there is any, is your total endshake amount. Now, it's said that the acceptable amount of endshake or play there generally should not exceed 0.004 of an inch of difference between those two measurements. Now, in some situations, excessive endshake can be repaired by a qualified gunsmith by stretching the length of the cylinder yoke tube. Down in here, we have to take the cylinder off and stretch that yoke tube down there of the cylinder. All right. Or you may be able to add endshake bearings. Again, you'll still have to take this off and completely disassemble the entire cylinder. And they do make endshake bearings of various thicknesses that you can use to put in there, or shims. Some people call them shims, which will take up some of the back play of that space. Now, either procedure there will ultimately push and set the cylinder rearward, okay? Because either way, we are essentially extending the length of this yoke tube in here, thereby slightly increasing the cylinder gap, so be mindful of that. And we'll get into cylinder gap shortly. And you can only move that cylinder back so far, or it's not going to fit back here. To determine if endshake is coming from the yoke shaft down in here, well, open your cylinder and go and move it frontwards and backwards. It's going to move a little bit. Again, that's acceptable. That's no problem. A minimal amount of movement is fine, but it shouldn't be excessive. And generally speaking, a loose yoke is the result of a worn yoke screw. Now that depends on the make and the model. All right, now let's talk real quickly about cylinder slop. Cylinder slop is similar to endshake, but it involves the rotational movement. The rotational movement of the cylinder while it's in lockup mode, or while the cylinder is locked in place, such as when the hammer is cocked. That cylinder should be locked in place. All right, in the firing mode here, just before the hammer falls, it should lock right there, right before the hammer goes into full cock mode. All right. Again, very slight amount of movement here is acceptable, but excessive movement or excessive play must be remedied, and in most cases it can be. Now, generally, this excessive side-to-side or rotational movement is due to improper engagement between the cylinder stop and the cylinder stop notches. The cylinder stop down here at the bottom and the notches that it's supposed to lock into. Is improper fitment there. All right, the cylinder stop itself could be worn. It could be damaged or otherwise deformed, causing insufficient interaction or engagement with the cylinder notches, which may also create timing issues. In this case, the cylinder stop itself can just be replaced. And the notches can be, in some cases, depending on the damage to it, can be remachined. That depends, though. But sometimes, like I said, it is the notches in the cylinder that causes that excessive play. They might be cut improperly, which is kind of rare, but it can happen. In my experience, though, the notches have become deformed over time from dumbasses that think it's cool to give the cylinder a hard spin and then violently wrist slap it shut, which will eventually widen and pile, what they call pile to one side, the metal on here. It'll widen these notches. All right. And it'll tear those notches, and it'll deform the lockup pin of the extractor as well. And also the extractor pin. See how that pin goes in there that fits in this lock hole right here? If you violently slam that over and over, you can bend that or warp it, and you'll also egg shape the hole back here where the pin is supposed to lock into. Those are going to give you all kinds of timing problems. All right. Now we're on to cylinder gap, or flash gap as it's called, which is the space between the center face and the forcing cone, or the rear of the barrel. Now you might see this expressed in writing as BC gap. Is it really anything to worry about? Well, I think it can be if it's excessive. If it's excessively close or tight, or it's excessively large. If you don't know yet, and perhaps you're new to revolvers, the forcing cone is basically the rear entrance of the barrel that protrudes into the cylinder window here. This is your cylinder window, and this is your forcing cone. Back of the barrel that sticks out right there, okay? Now inside that forcing cone, the walls are smooth for the first roughly ½ inch or so, and it's tapered like a cone, which is intended to force the bullet or the projectile itself into the rifling section to form a better gas seal and to impart, which is the grooves in the rifling, to impart bullet spin, right? which gives the bullet a gyroscopic effect when it's in flight. That keeps it stable and straight and actually increases its distance to your target before dropping from gravity. Now, it's important to inspect the forcing cone regularly, since cracks or fractures can occur here when shooting a lot of magnum loads on a regular basis. And, heavy lead deposits can build up right inside that forcing cone if you shoot a lot of cast bullets, particularly. At any rate, many people have differing views on exactly how to measure this flash gap. Cylinder pushed forward or the cylinder held to the rear. Well, I don't know. That's up to you. Personally, I check the gap tolerance when the hammer is fully cocked, just prior to the hammer fall, because it's just my belief that during this moment the cylinder face is as close to the forcing cone as it will ever get on its own. And I like to see a flash gap of at least 3/1000ths of an inch, but no more than 6 or 7/1000ths of an inch. But now that's just me. I don't necessarily load the chambers with spent brass and rely on the case rims to push the cylinder forward, as some people have suggested, since the case rims shouldn't be pressing against the frame anyway. Otherwise, it might create cylinder drag. Instead, most revolvers rely on the extractor star face right here to create the proper head space right there. Okay. The distance of your cylinder gap specifications can be different from one revolver manufacturer to the other, but I think that the majority agree that there should be no less than 2/1000ths of an inch, because anything much tighter than that has the real potential to allow for cylinder drag. Where the cylinder face and the forcing cone interfere with each other through the accumulation of fouling and hot lead spray buildup that's going to happen. Heavy cylinder drag can hinder trigger pull and in some cases damage or deform the ratchets of the extractor or the hand, which will ultimately lead to either cylinder bind or intermittent cylinder rotation. In some cases, this overly tight gap might be solved by trimming the length of the forcing cone by about 2/1000ths of an inch, preferably by using a facing jig, which will also square the breech up when you cut it. Now, I've seen guys use progressively finer diamond files or pads to trim the forcing cone, and that's fine, but you need to ensure that the forcing cone is perfectly square and level afterwards. On most Smith & Wesson revolvers, the cylinder gap is generally factory set at 4/1000ths of an inch, unless that's changed in recent years, and it probably has. And Taurus used to set most of their revolvers at between 200 and 300/1000ths, or 2/1000ths and 3/100,000ths. Oh, God. You know what I mean. Okay. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, your cylinder gap may be too large. Personally, I feel that a cylinder gap beyond 8/1000ths or 9/1000ths should probably be corrected, as this might exacerbate cylinder flash and or lead copper spray. However, some revolvers do just fine with cylinder gaps at or beyond that distance, depending on make and model. Now, closing that much of a gap will most likely require either a manufacturer or a certified gunsmith to correct, and probably by replacing the barrel with a longer forcing cone, or altering the same barrel by what's known as a barrel setback procedure. And this will require you to remove the barrel and cut the shoulder back to get another full turn of the barrel in order to bring the forcing cone closer to the cylinder face. All right, real quickly, we'll talk about one concern that a lot of people have with a large cylinder gap. And I kind of like to expound upon this concern about velocity loss caused by large cylinder gaps. Yes, it's true, a large cylinder gap will generally reduce velocity, but it's nowhere near the amount that I keep hearing about. I've heard velocity loss of 50%, losing most of your velocity through the larger cylinder gap and all that. The truth is, the loss of velocity is actually minimal. In an in-depth, extensive test conducted and documented regarding this very matter several years back by a company known as Ballistics by the Inch. Ballistics by the Inch. An exhaustive test involved the use of numerous types of handgun ammo in several revolvers of various calibers, types, and barrel lengths. The overall general finding in that report showed that most firearms will see an approximate 3 to 5% loss of velocity with a cylinder gap of 0.6 of an inch, compared to the velocity of a much tighter gap. Personally, I think that's hardly enough to be concerned with, but that's just me. Alright, let's close out this video with checking cylinder rotation. Now, one of the basic function tests taught at the Smith & Wesson Armorers Academy included slowly spinning the cylinder. Now, with the cylinder closed and the hammer held slightly back to disengage the cylinder stop under here from the cylinder to allow the cylinder to spin freely, slowly hand spin the cylinder in the same direction that it would rotate during the normal course of firing, which in this case is counterclockwise. Now, the tail of the cylinder notches, right here, the tail on these notches will indicate which way your cylinder rotates. Here, the tail is pointing downward, or in this direction, which tells you the cylinder rotates counterclockwise. All right. You want to hear solid clicking sounds. All right. When you do that, that's what you're listening for. That's called, the term used there is called singing during that cylinder rotation. Now, that clicking is caused by the extractor ratchets right here. And the hand that rotates, that grabs the ratchets and rotates it. All right, this hand slaps into these notches because there's tension on that, and it sticks out. And so it's constantly pressed up against that star, the ratchet star. And when you rotate it, it just slaps that those notches there. And that's where you get that. That's the cylinder hand, the rotating hand, and the notches. All right. That indicates that the spring and the hand and the spring that presses it against the ratchets are both strong and working properly. And it also demonstrates that the cylinder spins smoothly with no binding or drag. Now, if you don't hear the sing, then either the spring for the hand has weakened, or the hand itself has worn too much, or possibly the hand is hung up in the slot somehow, in the frame slot. The good news is that it's not hard to fix any of those problems. Okay, to avoid making this video too long and boring, let's hold what we have so far and pick up right here in Chapter 2 of Revolver Shite to finish it out. And keep in mind that some of the things I went over in here may not apply to your particular revolver. So that's this chapter of Revolver Shite. I hope I was able to help you out in some way. So keep your eyes open for more of the same in Chapter 2. I'm Antonius. Thanks for watching, and remember to keep shooting it straight. Until next time, ciao.